Okay, hey everyone, welcome back. So this is the second video of Design and Technology Prelim Theory, and today it's short. I'm going to talk about the design process. So your design process is essentially your practical projects. So when I give you a practical project and I give you a portfolio that you have to do as well, that's a pretty good example of what the design process is. Now, obviously, I've had to change it a little bit to make it work within a school environment, something that can be marked and assessed. One of the main differences between working in industry and working in school is the idea that we kind of mark a portfolio. So there is a reduced emphasis on the final product compared to industry. So in industry with the design process, often the end result is all your client cares about. Does it solve the problem that they've set out for you? In design and technology in high school, because we're really interested in the design process, we kind of value how you got there in a much more important way than the actual end product. So oftentimes we're looking for a prototype, so not even something that is necessarily market ready. We acknowledge the fact that you're a 17 or 18-year-old working in a school across a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, and it might not be viable to actually produce the product. And also you've set yourself a problem that may not have a real client. So if you don't have a real client, then oftentimes it's hard to actually create a final product that will exist in the industry. So it's kind of an emulation of the design process. So although you can say what you're doing in the class is very close to what a designer would be doing in industry, it's got some significant changes to it, but that's okay. What I'm going to teach you now is kind of, in my opinion and my experience as a designer, how the design process worked for me. So essentially, all design situations start with a problem. So there's an issue of some sort. Now, whether this issue is real, implied, made up, doesn't really matter. Someone comes to you with an issue, whether that's your boss, whether that's your inner monologue, whoever it is. You see something that you think is not as good as it could be in society, and it can be changed. Now, whether it actually needs to be changed or not is completely irrelevant. I say that again. The type of design process you use will depend on the difficulty of solving the problem. If you have an incredibly easy design solution, it's something that's obvious, you need to make a birthday card. So you might do a little bit of research into how to do that, but it's mainly going to be program use, if you are doing a graphic design of a birthday card. However, if it's, how to solve the over-reliance of society on fossil fuels, there's going to be quite a bit more research involved in that because it's a bigger design problem. I've got an example here. When to get out of bed in the morning. If that is your problem and what you're going to try and decide, that could be a design problem. And you need to do some research into that. So what time I get out of bed today may be a set defined time, or it could entirely be based on what I have due for that day. So if I need to get up to go to the gym at 6:30 in the morning, then that's going to obviously change the design solution. If I don't know those factors, it would completely change the way that I approach the problem. So, we need to research into what we want. We need to define what the actual problem is, and we need to define what a solution looks like. So there's a lot of ways of doing that. I'm going to talk through it in other videos. You need to have criteria to define your success, which is something that is very explicitly covered. So the first thing we need to do is we need to have a brief made for us, or we make the brief ourselves, depending on what stage we're at in design and tech and what industry we're working in, what position we are in a company. So essentially, you meet with a client, or you imagine meeting with a client if you're unable to meet with them, in school, and you work out what the actual problem is. There needs to be a need within society. So we define a need. If we're defining a need ourselves for a design technology project, we're going in and we're going, what is a problem with society that is terrible? Something that just is no good. And we research that, we research why it's no good, we look into it. Then the design brief comes out of that is some way, based on the need, how do we solve that need? So if we're doing a project on sustainability within our school, so we look at a problem, and the problem is the school is incredibly wasteful in terms of, electricity, rubbish, paper, all those sorts of things that schools tend to use a lot of. If we're looking into that, we define our problem, and then our design brief needs to come up with some limitations on that. So we're not going to solve rubbish at a school. It's not going to be solved by one thing. It's not going to be solved by one design solution. But you can take a little section of that and just go, the rubbish in one area of the school can be solved. That's the best way to do things, because if we take on a huge problem, then it becomes just overwhelming. So you take that little chunk, that little idea, and you're going to do your research, you're going to go into that, and you're going to go, what do I need to do to solve that? And you don't come up with the solution yet. First, you need to define the problem. That is the biggest problem that I run into with students. They see a problem, they immediately jump to the solution. And then all of this other stuff that you need to do in the portfolio is just making it up afterwards to fill it in. You really need to do this before you come up with your design solution. You need to really define your problem before you can solve it. Because what happens is people come up with too complex a solution. What you need, the best designs, in my opinion, and it is just my opinion, is when it's distilled as much as possible, when you take as much away from it until you just solve a single problem really well. You can then add back to that if you want, but the thing that I like to tell my students is the simpler your problem, the less work you have to do. And the more impressive it is. It's a bizarre thing about design and technology that often the more complex your problem, the more work you have to do, and the worse the design ends up being. So you actually get less marks by doing more work than if you just worked smartly. So if you had a table that solved a problem, you need to build legs. Are the legs relevant to solving the problem? No, then get rid of them. You don't need to make it. And, that's, take it with a grain of salt. Okay, you can't just do absolutely nothing, but that's something that you need to think about. So you decide what your brief is, and we'll talk about design briefs and what they are and what they involve later on. But you have your design brief, and then it either gets farmed out if it's in a design team to various designers, or if you're a student or a sole trader or a freelancer working alone, it sticks with you. So you sketch, you research, you problem solve, you test and experiment. So, I've got my client sitting over here. He's given me my first meeting. We've defined what a brief is. I can either do that with my client or I can do it on my own, but I probably would include the client so they feel that there's a sense of ownership. As designers, you should try and be as transparent as possible with your clients. Oftentimes, if your solution is quite simple, clients can be frustrated by that with how much money they've paid you for something that is relatively simple. If you keep this portfolio documentation in your career post-high school, if you are a designer, then you've got a lot to give your client and they're going to understand the value of your work. All right. So as you're going through, as you're testing, as you're looking at your tools and techniques, you'll evaluate. Now, whether you do that formally by writing it down, like you do in high school, it's very important to formally evaluate stuff. So, evaluate throughout your project, look at what worked, say why it worked, say what didn't work, but also say why and where it led to. So if something didn't work, please include it. A big problem that I have with students is they say that was garbage, it didn't work, I'm tossing it out, I'm only going to put in the stuff that works, because in almost every other class, you don't put in stuff that's terrible. If you are doing maths homework and you get it completely wrong and you redo the question, you don't want to put in your version that's all stuffed up. You want to show in the clean version where the working out works. That's what the scrap paper is for in, maths exams. You don't necessarily include that. Now, in design and tech, I want that scrap paper. That scrap paper is very, very important to me. You include it and you write why it was terrible. That is worth marks, and you always want to do that. So I want every single sketch, every single thing that you put in, every single idea, and that's the biggest thing that I can say about this. You need to just stick everything in. To a portfolio, it all needs to be evaluated, so why it worked, why it didn't work, and where it led to. Now, those don't need to be long evaluations, but you should really put them in. So we go through all of this, and we would have probably meetings throughout with the client if we can gain access to them. If you can't, your teacher can be the client, essentially, because When things are a project for school, the teacher will inevitably be a proxy for the client. So you go, you show them, you talk things through with them. The client will give their opinion on stuff. You either choose to follow the client's opinion, or you try and convince them that their opinion is wrong and your opinion as an expert designer is right. Now that is a whole another thing, as part of the design process that can be fairly frustrating, but there's ongoing meetings, there's clear communication throughout the whole thing. The importance of communication cannot be underestimated. So when I say communication, I mean talking like this, but I also mean sketches, clear drawings, all of those sort of things, so people understand what they're getting. Nobody wants, if you're an architect, nobody wants a first meeting and then a finished house 5 years later with no communication in between. That would be incredibly frustrating for everyone involved, and people, chances are, wouldn't be happy. You need, as a designer, to consistently be communicating, showing the client throughout it. So that is a huge part of the process. That's something that usually the client liaison, so the creative director or whoever it is in charge would be talking, rather than the entry-level designer or whoever's working with it. But you may be the only person working on a project, in which case you would be the link between them. So design is a cyclical process, so you don't just go in one direction from start to finish. When you test stuff and it goes right or it goes wrong, then you go in and you look at that information, you evaluate that information, and you use it building going forward. Eventually, you're going to find a clear direction and somewhere that you want to go. You're going to talk to your client about it, your client's going to like it, it's all good. So then you start going in one direction. But there's still going to be versions, there's still going to be iterations, there's still going to be, a cyclical nature to that where it goes around and around and around. Once we get somewhere where we're happy for version 1, though, to go through, then it goes and we manufacture it. We do whatever it needs. We make our prototypes. Then we go and look and show that to the client, who can approve or reject. Approve, reject, evaluate. So we keep on building. We make a better prototype. Approve, reject. It just keeps going. We take all the information that we get from that. We see whether it works or not. We test, we don't test, whatever it is that we do at each stage that's needed to say this is okay or this is bad. And we keep going. Then this could happen quickly, this could happen over a large amount of time. Eventually you have a final design that gets put out to market, but very rarely does that end up being the end. Oftentimes there will be either you or another designer, and then you'll go through there and you'll start the design process again. And that's an interesting thing to do, hopefully for you, because you're doing design technology, but the whole thing about it is it never really ends, unless it is the absolute final thing that's never going to change. But even buildings from like the 1400s that were designed back then are still being updated now every day. We're still putting in fire extinguishers. We're still changing materials to make them safer. The design process continues forever. So you're taking a little part of it, your part will end, someone else will take over and they'll improve what you did. And that's, it's nice to be a part of that, in my opinion. So the main thing that I talk about when we're looking at the domestic, community, and industrial and commercial settings is when you're doing it at home, when you're designing at home, it's not really formalized. You're just kind of like having a sketch, having to go in the workshop. You may not follow these steps. You might just go straight to building a prototype out of nowhere, testing it, seeing if it works, and if it works, it's great. So if I'm trying to, put up a fence, I have an idea in my head, I might make a sketch, go out and buy some wood, build it, works, sweet, no worries. But if I'm doing something that's for a big company, something that's formalized, something where there's a lot of money at play, a lot of resources, a lot of stakeholders, I'm really going to formalize that process to protect myself. And not just protect myself, just to make sure that everyone is happy. Because I can explain it to myself, I can explain it to my family, no worries. I'm never going to get a meeting with every single person in the bank where I can explain my design idea. But they can shoot around emails that are like, what do you think of this design? And they can get feedback and it can come back. So by formalizing that design process, I'm really able to make it work. That way other people that are involved tangentially, or people that are essentially too important to get involved with the design, can have their way about it. So that's the importance of the portfolio system. That's the importance of documentation. And whether it's a HSC style design folio or something a little bit different, like a style guide for a logo, even examples of it being used, that's something that you need to think about when you are doing the design process. Thank you.